if you are in the habit of knowing how you can structure your content well, then it shouldn't be as a daunting experience. Run sheets will help with live music programming, live radio programming and music programming, along with packaging content. Because just having something written down in a basic structural form can help you focus. And once you start editing, particularly if you've had a really good juicy interview that's, half an hour long and you've had a really good chat with someone, you really need to have some kind of structure before you start editing. Otherwise, you're just going to get lost in the editing process and you might come out the other side with something that's not really coherent, or a flow doesn't really flow in an appropriate way. So having run sheets and structure can help you give consistency to your content. I have a basic run sheet example that I can send through, but I'm sure HEaRd probably has some too, but we can include that in our resources that we provide. So just moving on to actual content and covering, so we've said, the start, middle and the end. So just focusing a little bit on the start and the end. And this, again, can translate across a live radio show, a pre-produced radio show, a podcast, a vodcast, what have you. It's about just thinking about those bookends, the start and the end of your show, and making sure you cover some key things. Because a lot of the time, particularly if we've been doing this a long time, we kind of forget some of the basics that we get taught when we do training. So thinking about actually when you start a program, mentioning the name of the program, mentioning your name or who your hosts are, so the introductions. This one, I know a lot of people, when I listen to a lot of shows, they don't really give me any understanding of what the content of the show or the podcast might be about. And I like to actually, just kind of like a book, when you can read a synopsis on the back, you get an understanding if it's something you want to commit to listening to or to reading. So, when you're introducing yourself, hi, my name's Michelle. I'm part of the Women's Health Program. And I'm joined by Irene this morning. And today we're going to talk about blah, blah, blah. And again, just like we started with this morning, we want to include some important information that we might need to, such as sponsors or disclaimers. So, making sure that if you are supported by grant funding or a major sponsor that actually helps you produce your content, that acknowledging them usually at the start and the end is something that you might want to think about. And again, if you have regular content going out, including where people can actually find more information or subscribe or, join your social media, subscribe to your social media. So making sure that you're telling people. And generally this is sort of more at the end of a program or a content, you would say, you can find out more from our webpage or join us on social media and have a bit more of a discussion. Those type of things are a good way to end content as well. When you're thinking about producing your content, like I touched on in the opening, you should kind of think about actually where the destination and whether there are multiple avenues for you to use that content on. So for example, let's say we're looking at interviewing a young female musician that was going to be performing as part of WOW, and we think, okay, this is for my program or my radio show, but how else can I make sure that I'm recording and interviewing this musician so that that content could actually be used on other programs or as part of other packages. So for example, for a young female musician, it could be packaged for a special youth broadcast on the community radio network or part of a youth programming, as well as a women's program. So think about where else the content might end up. Sometimes you might not want to replicate the exact same interview for all the destinations. So you might want to do a couple of edits. This is obviously would take a lot more time, but if you have that time and inclination, then, you know, I think that's a great idea, particularly if you've asked enough questions that you could actually have two quite different interviews that were recorded in the one session. So you might end up with one that's specifically talking about women and their place in the music industry and how far we've come, if we've come anywhere, and then it could also be sort of youth focused. So you know, you could edit that interview so it's quite different across the destination channels. So yeah, think about that, because that will help you develop some of your questions and your interviewing technique before you even get into the actual interview itself. Oh, and just think about the time. So sometimes when we're interviewing people, particularly musicians, it might be about a time-specific event or release. So think about how you can actually steer clear of being too time-specific, or how you can edit that so it might be relevant to air, you know, then in the following week, because there's an event coming up. But think about how you could edit out, or you could change the narrative so it wasn't so much about that event. So it could be a more relevant longer term, so people can listen, you know, for another year or two without it being like time specific. So just now we're going to sort of talk more about that interviewing and the approach and organising the interview. If you were part of our approaching media last week, this is again the flip side of that. So this is how you as interviewees might you know, approach someone about getting them to be interviewed on your show or as part of your content creation. And I know, again, a lot of you already might be radio broadcasters, so you know, I'm preaching here to you all, but it's a good reminder. And for those that, you know, might not have the confidence, it's, you know, it's good to go through this. So generally you need to kind of work out before you approach someone whether you might prefer an in-person interview or to get them into a studio, or you can do it over the phone or online. You may not want to stick hard and fast to this, so you might prefer they come into the radio studio, and that would be your first request. But don't limit yourself to that's it. You know, you're only going to be able to do that because your talent, or the person that you want to interview, may just not have the ability to come into a studio or the time. So give options is always best if you can. And then generally, you know, step-by-step approach. If you're, let's say, for this one, you know, we've got their phone number, we've given them a call. This could also be, you know, via email, but you want to introduce yourself and make it clear where you are from or who you are representing. So for example, you know, hi, this is Michelle Brown. I am hoping to ask. So, hi, this is Michelle Brown. I'm from the Women of the World Australia project, and we're interviewing women about their place, about their careers or their place, or what they're working on. And I'm really interested in interviewing you. And so, you know, you make sure that you're making it clear from the get-go where you're from and what you want to ask them about. You can then, you know, tell them what some of those questions that you might be talking about. So I kind of did that in my terrible introduction because I'm trying to think off the cuff, which is sometimes difficult. And I've only had one coffee this morning. But you want to get to the point pretty quickly, basically, is what I'm trying to get at. And if you can say, again, this is why I want to interview. So some of the questions will be about, you know, how you've made it as a musician, or why you're part of this, why you started this community initiative, something like that. Be polite and friendly, because that will get you more places than not. And yeah, again, know exactly why you want to talk to them so you can communicate that clearly. I obviously didn't communicate very clearly when I tried to do that just now, because I'm trying to make stuff up. But once you know who you want to talk to and why you want to talk to, then you should be able to communicate that pretty clearly. And give them a, you know, brief. So tell them how long the interview might be, and arrange a time that suits them if you can. Sometimes it's good to just start with options. So, hi, you know, it's probably be a half-hour interview. I'd love to get you in the studio next Tuesday between, you know, 9 and 12 if possible, but totally understand your schedule. So let me know what might suit, because you're giving them firstly an option, which they can be like, oh, yep, good, that's fine, I'll work it out. Or then you're giving the onus back to them to actually to tell you what suits them. This one, depending on how busy they are, how busy everyone is, you know, it's good if you can build a bit of a rapport. So have a little chat and get to know them a bit, but you don't want to cover too much before you actually get to the interview, because you want to have a little bit of a element of surprise, or you know, you want to learn more during the interview process along with your audience, rather than knowing all that, because then you won't concentrate as much on listening. And we'll get to why listening is important soon. But definitely confirm the details. If you lock something in, thank them for the time. Say, I will book this in and send via email, because if you can set calendar reminders, that will definitely help. We're all very busy, and there's nothing worse than, you know, you thinking, oh, you've confirmed all that information. You get to the day you're supposed to come into the studio and they don't turn up because, oh, I didn't ever received a confirmation from you. So don't just leave it as a phone confirmation. Make sure you know, put it in writing for them, and just, you know, do as much as you can so they don't have to do much work except turn up and be interviewed. So when you're preparing questions, and this one, I'm sure, again, preaching to the choir here, but a good place to start when you're preparing questions is just your 5 W's and a H. So who, what, where, why, when, and how. And, you know, you don't want to be just like, who are you? What do you do? Where are you from? That kind of thing. You want to turn those who, what, where, when, and what, how into appropriate, interesting questions. Writing your questions down beforehand will help avoid those sort of mental blanks during the interview sessions. And if you can, rather than writing down the questions verbatim, maybe just have some simple dot points, so that it doesn't sound like you're rehearsed and you are reading straight from paper or screen. So bullet points help. Your first question is generally your most important one and can set the tone for an interview. So generally, if this was more hard-hitting news type interview style, you might want to cut to the main angle that you wish to explore. So for example, your local councillor is campaigning for something in the community, and so that might be the main angle you wish to talk to them about. So the first question could be like, so you're campaigning for this particular item in our community. Can you tell us a bit more about why you're so passionate about this, or can you tell us more about the issue? Because that's going to extend that interview to be a bit more focused on that, rather than how did you get into politics, and why are you, just all that sort of background stuff that can come a bit later, or is it really relevant, the good stuff, rather than setting things up too much. So a few important things when you're developing questions: don't ask closed questions, because a closed question is a question that will just get you a yes or no or short answer, and these aren't particularly useful specifically in a radio environment where it's based on sound. So you're hoping that this interview can last 15 minutes and you've just prepared a bunch of questions where they're just going to say yes or no. You don't really give your avenue to get out of that, so be careful. Excuse me, there is a fly. And make sure you ask a question. I know this one I hear so much, particularly on radio, because a lot of the time we're just trying to get our guest comfortable or to get them to open up, and that can be sometimes difficult. But just be careful that you're not just providing statements. So instead of asking a question, you're saying, so you're campaigning for this particular issue. That's more of a statement than a sort of a question. So, why are you campaigning for this particular issue? You can use statements to give background and context, but make sure there's a question with it. So, you can have a short paragraph that explains what an issue is, but then you're asking a question to get them talking about that further. If you can, keep your questions short, because if your questions are too long or you ramble, then you're going to confuse your talent, and you won't get a clear answer or a definitive sort of answer. And if it's too confusing for the person you're interviewing, then your audience, your listeners, will also get confused. And don't ask more than one question at once. You only get one answer. So the double barrel question. This happens a lot in more mainstream media. I've found, particularly like talk show style formats, where they ask a couple of questions at the same time, banging hard questions. But that doesn't give your interviewee a chance to answer sort of the question, because they're like, oh, which one should I answer? Or you'll only get one response. So be careful of those. Same with leading questions. So don't lead your interviewees into a particular answer or trap them in a corner. It's quite similar to the statement one. So, just be aware that if your question is too specific, then you're backing everyone into a corner. You won't get much out of that. And try and progress from point to point in maintaining logic to your interview. So, it should follow from the previous one. And this is where a good interviewer will be able to change on the go. So you might have your list of questions, and I've seen this happen a lot of time and get interviewers sort of in trouble because they've got their list of questions, and the talent has just answered your next 3 questions in the one answer. So you can't just keep going. You can't just ask those 3 questions, because that would sound silly, because they've just told you the answers to those, so they're just going to be reiterating what they've just said. So you've got to be able to be flexible and quickly go, okay, got to skip all those questions, but I have a few backup ones down here, and choosing the one that would flow on the best from the last discussion you just had is a really good technique if you can do it. I know this one is hard, but you get the hang of it. And it's all about listening. If you're a good listener as well as a good interviewer, then it'll be a comfortable interview. You'll know your cues. You'll hear you'll be able to change what you need to change to continue the interview successfully.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've noticed listening to some of the interviews that we put out. Sometimes the person who's doing the interviewing is too focused on their list of questions, and they miss an opportunity to flick across to something that might be more exciting or interesting that gets raised, because they're not actually listening to the answers. They're just running through their questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point to make.
And, you know, it takes practice, but you've just got to multitask. We're women, we're good at multitasking. So think about, you know, what you could structure your sheet, even your question sheet, to have sub questions. So you could even have a little flow chart, I guess, like, so if they start talking about this, you know, have break off questions that could help you, but don't get bogged down in just reading that. Listening and responding to what your interviewer is responding to you is really good. And don't be afraid to ask for clarification if you don't understand something, because your audience probably won't understand it if you don't either. So it's better to ask rather than just move on. But also don't be too ignorant before the interview. Like, have a little bit of research on the topic you're going to be talking about, or the person that you're going to be talking, because there's nothing to me more infuriating than listening to an interview where the person plays the I have no idea who you are, you tell us everything about you kind of role, because to me that's kind of, it feels just a little bit
Lazy.
Yeah, that and insulting. I'm like, why did you want to interview me if you have no idea who I am, kind of thing. So do a little research. Yeah. When you're conducting the interview, again, this is going to cover a few things that we just talked about, but just specifically rather than when you're developing the questions, when you're going through the interview, stay focused on what you want to get from the interview. So think about that before you start. Are you just, interviewing them because you needed someone to fill your show for next week and you hadn't planned anyone? That's okay. But what do you want to get out of them from the interview? You still want good content, right? So make sure that you focus on what you specifically want to talk to them about. Make sure you tell the person's name and position, or, you know, who they are and what you're going to talk about when you're introducing them. Don't give too much away though. Again, questions should be short as possible to give the respondent time to answer as well. Remember, when you're interviewing someone, it's not about you, it's about them. So you can create and focus on some really interesting questions, but your end goal is to get the really juicy and interesting answers. Delivery, be clear, concise, and sound interested. Again, you know, a good interviewer must be a good listener. So even if you're not interested, if you can try and sound interested and encouraging, then that will get you more of a response too. And if they're talking too long on a subject, it is appropriate for you to try and move them on as politely as you can, because two things. Think about that headache of editing that down, because you know you can only fit in, 10-minute interview, and they've just given a long-winded monologue for 10 minutes. So you need to think about how you can politely refocus, which can be techniques like, okay, so interrupting. So, yep, that sounds terrific. Like, I'm glad you covered that. But how about, and try and move to sort of the next question in that sort of techniques. Really, it's just being about, polite and focused. And they might not even realize that they're talking too long. So sometimes it's helpful if you give them a little nudge. Listen to the answers. So again, we covered that one, but the interesting points that they mention. So if they are even talking for a long while, try and, have your piece of paper there with your pen. Write down a few key words that they might mention when they're responding to an answer, so that those can then be your next questions, or you can ask follow-ups. Maybe so let's say that's a female musician who's performing, and they mention a new venue that you've never heard of, just write down venue. So then once they've finished responding to that question, you can say something like, so you mentioned such and such venue. I've actually never heard of that one. Is that a new one? And they might be like, yes, I'm going to be the first one who performs there, or something like that. So, just getting those keywords that might help you do those follow-ups. Keep it simple. Don't let the interviewee generalize or use technical terms too much, unless that's what you're focused on. For example, if you were interviewing a scientist about, something, and they were getting really technical and more clinical on what they're explaining, just again, you could politely interrupt and say, I myself don't understand those sort of terms. Is there a way that you can bring that back to some more simple terms that we could all understand? Things like that. And which sort of follows into keep your questions and comments at level of broad comprehension. So unless it specifically calls for it, just remember you've got a wide audience, so making sure that everyone can get something out of the interview is good. This one harder to do when it's over the phone, but a lot of the time it's good to look interested to your interviewee. So using facial expressions and just nodding your head on radio, or recorded broadcast, the murmuring yes doesn't work so well, because it just sounds like weird, because people can't see that like you can when you're being interviewed in a video or live environment. You can see that person responding, and you can hear that their hms and yeses correspond to things. But on audio, it just kind of sounds weird when there's an occasional, it sort of sounds more interrupting. So just be careful with that. You can still, if you see them, you can still do that. And just with the tone of your voice. So for radio, for on air, on the phone, sorry, if you can't see them, the tone of your voice can help with the sounding interested and encouraging. And the last question, so closing. So when you've covered everything you think you need to, or your time's up, you need to try and finish that interview up. So using things like, finally, it's been a pleasure talking to you. We're going to wrap this up now. I appreciate you coming in. Getting that, having that sort of closing statement, closing question, our last question for today, so everyone knows that, this is the last chance we've got to talk about something, or, we know there's an end. So that's kind of the main things I kind of wanted to cover for the interviewing and techniques. So moving more to the editing side of things now, because when you're packaging and curating your content, no matter how great your interview questions and things are, you might want to make sure. Sorry, I just saw a chat question from Marta, and yes, so no-go areas for the interviewee. There is definitely a good idea to chat to your talent, your interviewee, beforehand. And usually if there's someone who's quite high profile, they'll probably have someone that will tell you what you can't talk about, or what you shouldn't sort of ask questions about. But it's also a good idea for you as an interviewer to ask that beforehand as well. Depending on what you're trying to get out of it. As media, if you are, representing media in an unbiased manner, then you may want to ask those difficult questions that they don't want to respond to. But if it's something that's more of a community or less news content, then you kind of you might want to say, hey, is there something that you don't like to talk about in interviews, or are there no-go areas? So yeah, I would definitely ask that if it was a more casual interview beforehand. But if it was a hard-hitting news piece I was trying to get, then no, I would put them on the spot. So just think about, again, it's about the destination. What are you trying to get out of this? Where's it going to go? And making sure that you've thought about that one. Good question, Marta. So editing techniques. We've all listened to audio, I'm sure. And generally, we can hear what makes a good mix or what doesn't, because we'll turn it off if it's not doing it for us. If we're having trouble hearing the vocal mix, if we can't understand things, why would you keep listening? So generally, you want to make sure the overall mix is at a broadcast standard, be that if it's podcast, just online, if it's broadcast, you need to make sure it's good quality. So some of the things for that is making sure the voiceover is higher in the mix. So if you have backing music or backing soundtracks, you can definitely hear the voice over on speakers and headphones. I recommend listening back to any content when you think when you've done your sort of first draft edit, listening with headphones and on speakers, because the sound can be quite different. So when you're listening with headphones, you can hear that voice clearly and sounds great, but then you listen through speakers, like computer speakers, and then it's all muffled. So I always suggest doing a twice listen on headphones and speakers, but also making sure your music and your voiceover levels are consistent. So if this is more, I guess, for content that might have music in it, if you play a track and then you come back into speaking the voiceovers, you need to make sure that they're same levels. Nothing worse, particularly when you're listening in the car or something, when you'll have to turn up and turn down. So the song comes on, it's good volume, and then the speaking comes in and it's way too quiet. So you're turning things up, then the song comes on again and you're like, it's too loud. We don't want that. We want people to have a good listening experience and not have to touch their volume knobs. And some of the tips for that is learning to do your, equalization of your recording. So you can't do much with the music because that's usually already mixed and should be appropriate. So it's generally up to you and your editing skills to get those voiceovers equalized, making sure there's clarity between low, mid and high frequencies. And I just recommend, if you've got the opportunity to go along to Audacity training, I know that 4AB is still doing meetups for the Audacity training. Those are just really good because you get to understand this stuff a bit better. And just with editing, again, if you want to get creative, include effects and cool stuff. I love that because I think it is good storytelling, but just do it when it's appropriate. You don't need a sound effect for everything. If you're talking about so for example, a cooking show or something, you don't have to have pots and pans every 5 seconds. So just think, use when appropriate. So just this is a really good one. So this is something that the CMTO is a community media training organization. So I pulled from one of our advanced mixing sessions this slide because I think it's a really, really important one when you're doing editing of interviews. And they talk about using razor blades and pencils to cut tape in the old days, and that was like the first edit they would go through and they would cut out the good parts. But you want to take out the chunks of content that you don't want, so that you're only left with stuff that you're going to edit. which was often referred to as content editing. So what this goes on to talk about is we have a lot of repetitive phrases and ums and ahs that we think, oh, I'll just get rid of all those in my first edit because that's going to help. But that actually stops you focusing on the narrative and the story, and you're just getting into the detail too quickly. So because in digital editing, it's so much easier to edit and cut. Do a first edit, which is actually just making sure you're keeping all the good stuff. Don't worry about the ums, the ahs, the pops, whatever. None of the sort of technical stuff. Listen for the story. Listen for the good content. Get rid of all the other stuff you don't want. Then you're left with, I guess, the second and third edit, which is often referred to as the cosmetic editing. So on the second edit, you can cut out smaller phrases or unnecessary asides, or you've got a little workflow of what you think this interview is going to end up with. So maybe there was a few questions and responses that don't really fit the story. Cut them. Remember, you always got to keep that original recording because you might need it later on. So don't fully delete everything, just save sessions. So you could have edit 1, edit 2, edit 3 as your sessions or something. But yeah, once you get it down to the content you want, then you can do your third edit, which is cutting out your ums and your ahs and getting the audio quality to where you want it to be. So yeah, definitely very into that one. Fades and music levels. So sort of talked about this just before, but just to remind you about, just like with analog mixing, so you're in the studio, you're getting your levels correct when you're broadcasting, but it's the same when you're digitally editing and piecing together, packaging content. You want to make sure that the music and words are all mixed together well. So understanding the VU meters and different ways you can control that levels of your audio in your editing software of choice. So usually all digital audio workstation DAWs software, so what we use to edit, has channel volume. So that's, an easy way if you've got different channels of the speaking parts, the music parts, that kind of thing, you can use that efficiently before you have to get into too much detail on the actual fixing volumes and sound on the individual files. Fades. So fades are a really nice way of producing good content. So, fading things in and out. When you fade down a last track and you start to sort of talk over that last bit, always sounds quite nice if you do it well. But yeah, just play around with those fades in and out and make sure that they're not too long and it's a smooth flow. And again, that last one, which I mentioned before, listen to mixes of voice and music on speakers and headphones, because music is always too much louder, I found, for most people. Atmosphere. So Atmos, this is very important when I bang on about whenever I'm talking editing of audio or video content, and it's capturing atmospheric recording. So you're out on location and you're interviewing someone. Take a minute and ask everyone to not speak, or they've finished, they've gone, or it's just you or what have you. If there's a couple of you, just say, hey, I'm just going to record the sound of the environment for a minute, because that's going to help you when you have problems in your edit that you need to cut out, and then you've got weird jumping background sound. So having the atmosphere as a backing option can sometimes help cover those weird silent breaks that you've created, or other weird sort of sounds. So yeah, just when you're recording, particularly if you're out using one of those Zoom recorders, just a minute or so either end of the interview, keeping just that silence. Sounds like silence, but when you listen back to it, it's birds chirping, it's, you know, crickets cheeping, whatever they do. It's, you know, cars, it's wind, that kind of stuff, because that will help in a nice, you know, you're keeping it very quiet in the background, but it stops it from going, when you're listening to something, from plain nothing, silence, back into an interview, if you've had to cut and fill. So that's pretty much the main things. Oh, look, I did pretty good there. I thought I would go over the hour, but they were the main things that I wanted to sort of cover. But I think the question time is really important for this one, because, and I want to hear more from those who have been doing a bit of content capture for a while, and any tips and tricks that you might have to share. So I think.
Okay, that'll do, donkey. Put this baby in. Beautiful here.
So does anyone have any questions?
Driving my car with.
We're going to be, it's a bit quiet today. Yes, Charmaine.
I just wanted to say thank you to Joe and Michelle. I've attended all 3 of the sessions, and that's not my question, of course. The amount of information that you've given us so freely and so willingly has been amazing. So thank you for setting it up, Joe, and for Michelle for your wonderful content. My question is, the way you've structured this part of the podcasting series, if you've used interviewing as a lot of the focus for your podcast. What if you wanted to just speak freely? How does that affect your podcasting skills, or would you be able to implement the information you gave us today? And I come to the conclusion that it must be terribly trying to keep the attention of the audience for 10 or 15 minutes. But how does one overcome that? And before you give me an answer, I wanted to say that my favorite interviewers are Lee Sales, the lady that does SBS Insight, and the young bloke that's doing Q&A. I watch all of those 3 sessions diligently because of the way they actually put their questions together. And by far the one that gets the most brownie points and can really push the barriers of when people answer, and she knows exactly how to keep it flowing, is Lee Sales. So my question is, if you want to do a podcast solely, and how do you get the attention of the audience for that 10 or 15 minutes that you're just going to be talking?
Great question, Charmaine. And I think there's sort of 2 things here. One is, I'm just going to mention, so yeah, Lee Sales, she's brilliant at interviewing. She's been doing it a long time. She does it well, and she can be quite, you know, unbiased sometimes, and just, you know, you can tell that she's a journalist in some regards, whereas some interviewers, you know, it can be, you know, you can see some bias in what they're asking. So I think the more you watch and listen to the techniques that they're doing is going to be really helpful for your own skill building. But coming back to, let's say you want to do a podcast where it's you sharing your stories, and you don't really have any guests, you know, you're not going to be interviewing anyone. You can still kind of use these materials, but point it back to yourself. So you're not asking yourself those questions, but you're structuring your story in a way that is similar to, you know, pretend you're on, and this is one of my favorite interviewing shows, and it had an interviewer and a person, the actor's room. So I can't remember his name. He passed away recently, but it was an older show where he just, there was a little auditorium and it was for acting students, and they came in and he had, you know, famous actors come sit with him on stage. And he was just kind of there to let them tell the story, and he would just sort of prompt occasionally. But it was a beautiful, relaxed way of storytelling that kind of, you could just really see the vulnerability of the guests, you know, the interviewees just opening up and talking. So even if you don't have someone there to interview you, but you know, you'll want to tell your story, think about it in that regard. Think about that, you know, there you've got another of you sitting on your shoulder saying, but how did you get to this stage, or things like that. So have your own little prompts to keep you focused. If you've got an interesting story to tell, then people will listen to 15 to 20 minutes. But again, it's the content that you're telling. If you're just going to be maybe just, you know, talking about your day, you know, I got up, I got ready, I worked, you know, that's sort of not something that, you know, people want to listen to. But, you know, you've got an amazing story, Charmaine. So I think that, you know, you'll connect with people if you give that vulnerability, if you give that connection. And that's key to really good content. You need to find the connection with your audience, and usually they'll find you because, you know, they've got similar circumstances, or they're enjoying hearing those types of stories. You know, as women, we love hearing about, you know, success stories of other women and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
There's a question there from Seema. Thanks for the information on interview skills. I just wanted to ask if it's a good idea to break long interviews with some music or sponsorship adverts.
Oh, yes, that was a good one. Good one, Seema. I probably should have included that somewhere. But our attention spans, usually we say in radio, you know, 5-6 minutes of talk max, then break it up with something. Be that a, you know, a program ID, a sponsor, a music, you know, a song, just a, you know, something to break it up. But I think, you know, that's more for sort of radio listening. But I think with podcasting, you can get away a little bit more with longer form dialogue. Yeah, if you want to, if it's just you, yeah, it's harder to break it up. But if you have someone on your show, like if you're doing a podcast, if you do it with someone else, you're going to have a little bit more of an opportunity to have to break into the, you know, say for example, you're doing a 15-minute piece on something that's really emotional or hard-hitting topic, then you may want to try and break that up a little bit, just to not have everyone feeling, you know, too depressed after listening for too long. So sometimes that's why I say doing a podcast with two people can help, just because you can banter off each other, or you can support each other with keeping the message. But again, you can use atmosphere, music, sound effects to tell a really good long form story. Any other questions?
If there's no other questions, we will wrap it up. You will all hear from us next week via email. And then we look forward to hearing back from anyone who's keen to continue the journey with us.